Evidence of climate change. So our driving question for this video and this lesson is, how do we know climate change is happening? And our learning target, I can analyze data about Earth systems to make evidence-based predictions about current and future impacts due to climate change. So after this lesson, you are going to select a graph or a data visual of climate change that you are then you're going to interpret and be ready to share with the class. Your objective is to be able to summarize and explain the meaning of your selected data visual. This is an example of what your final product might look like, where you have the visual that you selected, you create a table where you're identifying particular things, and you write a 3-sentence summary of the visual. So when I say data visual, what I'm going to give you a vocabulary term here, and that's called infographic. And an infographic is, just as its name says, info, meaning information, and graphic, visual. So an infographic is a visual way to show data, to highlight patterns, and draw attention to important information. It's basically, you can think of it as a useful visual. All right, so what's the purpose of an infographic? Well, if you are taking a look at this data table, this is not an infographic. There's nothing really visual here. It's a line of data, and actually this is just a section of all of these countries. You can see from Afghanistan down to Brazil. So basically, this is a line of data that if I were to scroll down would be 106 rows long. Is it easy to identify the patterns that are going on in this data? Honestly, not really, right? These are just numbers. So let's make an infographic out of this so that we can make this easier to understand. And here is an infographic of that particular data. From this, we can understand, okay, here is a map showing all of these countries in the world, and I can identify based off of the title as well as this color coding that we have here that we are talking about the share of population with access to electricity. And it's much easier to tell this story about what is going on in the world and which countries do and don't have access to electricity in 2020. This infographic makes that information so much more easy to digest, and that's the purpose of why we make and use infographics. So let's talk about different kinds of infographics that you might see in this evidence of climate change lesson. So we might see there are different kinds of maps. There are also these, I don't know what these are called. I'm going to call it like an area plot. Somebody can correct me with that. But these particular ways of showing graphical information with a timeline, and here's our y-axis. You might have things where we have like a number line going on, or you might have something that is maybe in this kind of realm that's a little more familiar, where we have a x and y line graph. What might feel different about the kind of data that we see is we're pretty used to in math and science class having pretty clean lines, but you're not going to see as much really, really clean data. There's a little more interpretation to it, and we can see here that we have these fluctuations. That's what I call these ups and downs. And there's multiple lines on the graph, so it takes a little more nuance and understanding to interpret some of the patterns that we see in some of these more complex infographics. All right, so what do you need to do with these infographics? Well, you need to select one and summarize the meaning presented in different types of graphs and visuals. So that's going to look like you're going to need to identify what variables are being displayed, interpret the patterns, point out small details, annotate, or which is a fancy word for draw and write on the infographic to draw attention to those important parts, right? Those patterns and those small details. And use the most important information and your annotations to write a 3-sentence summary that explains the main idea. Okay. Sounds like a lot, but I'm going to break this down for you. Here is an example infographic that we have right here. Let's pretend like you selected this one, and you're going to fill in the notes that you have in your notebook to see how you would complete the table and that summary at the end. So the first thing that I want you to do always when you get your figure is I'd like for you to read the caption. In this case, the caption says that figure 1, 3 different global surface temperature records, all showing increasing trends over the last century. The lines show annual differences in temperature relative to the 1901-1960 average. Okay, that's helpful. I understand that these 3 lines are all recordings from the same time that are just taken around the world. So these 3 lines are just different groups that have been taking measurements on temperature. This also helps me understand, okay, this is about temperature and annual differences in temperature relative to the 1901-1960. Okay, so this is temperature change, right? So that 0, is that like average line. All right. I've kind of acquainted myself with the data. I'm now going to start my mastery check basically, right? So first thing I need to do is write down the title. And then I need to identify the variables. It's kind of nice. This one is a graph, so I'm pretty comfortable with knowing, okay, I've got my year and temperature change. Great. Year and temperature. Easy. Might be a little harder if you're looking at a map. You might have to interpret what those variables are a little bit more. All right, now I'm going to dig into some of the stuff that so this is observations, things that I notice, and then this is what I think that those observations mean. So here's my first one. I am going to point out a small detail here. I am going to point out this highest point that I see on the graph. So I'm placing a little dot there, and I am identifying where it lands on the axes. So the y-axis is temperature change. In 2010, the line is at 1.5 on the y-axis, and here is that coordinate point. So now I'm going to interpret what that means. The y-axis shows difference in temperature. Okay, difference in temperature. So 0.0 means no change. In 2010, it was 1.5 degrees warmer than the average in the early 1900s. So that's what that 1.5 means. All right. For my second point, I'm going to look at some patterns, and I sort of identified that I see this pattern going on here. Basically, I find it kind of helpful to cover up the graph here a little bit, and I want to just focus my attention on this section. What I notice is that from 1850 until about 1930, the line goes up and down, but the overall trend is horizontal. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to annotate the graph here. I notice that although the line is, and we call this actually, this is called fluctuating, although it's going up and down, the overall trend that I see is this kind of straight horizontal trend. So what I interpret that to mean is that the temperature was staying about the same during that time. Even though it's kind of going up and down, the overall pattern is that from 1850 to 1930, the temperature really didn't change. Okay. So now I want to tackle this other section of the graph. Obviously, there's a change going on here. Okay, so I'm kind of boxing what this part is about. And I see that starting in 1930, the line starts going up diagonally. Great, let me go ahead and I'll write that in. All right, so here's my, okay, there's my kind of diagonal line to simplify that. And I think this means that this shows an increase in average temperature. Okay, so now I have 3 different things that I noticed, and I didn't put my interpretations in here. I just explained what I saw, and then I explained what I think that means on this in this column. So putting all of this together, this figure shows an effect of climate change on temperature, right? That's the thing that I'm seeing change. That's the effect. We can see from this data that the temperature stayed about the same from 1850 to 1930 as evidenced by the horizontal trend. Okay, I'm identifying that point. Starting in 1930, the temperature started rising. Okay. In 2010, it was 1.5 degrees warmer than it was in the early 1900s. Notice that in my final kind of summary of it, I didn't include everything that I observed on there. I already had that written down. So my final summary is mainly my interpretations of the data. And that helps to keep my final summary kind of short. All right, so revisiting the essential question. Our driving question is, how do we know climate change is happening? And your job is to answer that by analyzing data about Earth systems to make evidence-based predictions about current and future impacts due to climate change. So by doing this, you will be able to answer this driving question for one piece of evidence. By itself, it's not a very good answer to this, but once we stack everybody's responses together, we should have a pretty clear understanding of how we know that climate change is happening. All right, again, for your mastery, what you are about to do is you're going to collect a infographic. You are going to identify which variables are displayed in that infographic, interpret some of those broad patterns that you see, as well as pointing out small details, pointing to specific points on that infographic, whether it's a map or a graph. And you're going to use that information to write a 3-sentence summary that explains the main idea. Your grade is based off of the data table that you make that shows your observations with the interpretations and the summary that you make. I would love for you to make those annotations as well. There are dry erase markers that you can use since these are laminated visuals, but you do not have to for your grade.